Hello, everyone, and welcome to the ninth episode of Clear Files. Today, we actually have a very unique new style of interview. So basically, I won't be doing the interview for this particular interview. Instead, I'll be the one being interviewed. And today, to interview me, we have our guest, Miss Samuelson. Miss Samuelson, could you quickly introduce yourself?
Sure. So I worked with Sihun this year on his personal project journey. We go way back to middle school where we had classes together. So this has been a one-on-one opportunity to reconnect and to meet throughout the year. And so now we're coming to the end of that. So thanks
Yes.
for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for coming and thank you for joining. So like I mentioned earlier, this interview is going to be me being interviewed about the process that I went through in during this personal project. So I think you can just get started.
Sure, let's do it. So let's like go back to the sort of the beginning when we were placed together, like mentor and mentee. How did you first conceive of your idea? What inspired you? What was going on at that time for you?
Yes. I think I've always been very interested in social issues and topics in the world. And I think one of the main reasons I decided to focus on this particular aspect of social issues, which is kind of raising awareness and finding
Mm-hmm.
ways to deliver that information in a way that's more relatable and more direct. Is as I was talking with a lot of my peers, oftentimes I found that they weren't really interested in these topics. They didn't really care as much about the different events that were going on. And so I just kind of naturally came to wonder why they might not be interested, what was preventing them from taking an interest on these topics that to me seemed so important and so relevant.
Right.
And one of the main reasons that I found was because a lot of times students and peers have a very hard time relating to whatever whatever the news source is saying. Oftentimes they're very professional. So if you don't really understand the full context, it's very hard to understand what's going on in that particular issue. Another problem is oftentimes they're very biased or they only
Mm-hmm.
show one side of the story and then immediately makes um, the audience realize that this isn't really something that they want to be looking at anymore.
Sure.
So that's kind of what inspired me to take on this
Yeah.
project.
Were you struggling with you bring up bias? Do you think this notion of like fake news or news that isn't trustworthy, did that play a part in students being interested in these current events?
Yeah, I think so the approximate period of time that I started to become actively interested in these social topics and issues was when I was in sixth grade, so when I first moved up to middle school.
Mm,
And I think to kind of connect it to a major event that happened during that year, which was like around 2016, that's when
yeah.
Donald Trump became president of the United
Right.
States of America. And I think with him becoming president, fake news became a concept that was, um, I think, very, or at least a term that was very popularized
Sure.
by him and other politicians during that period of time. Before that, I don't think it was as popular of a topic or that people
Right.
didn't really consider it to be that big of an issue.
Right.
But afterwards, and so I think definitely it did play a part in people losing credibility in the different sources out there, even if it is a credible source. Oftentimes, politicians or other figures might label it as fake news or not a credible source. And then that kind of results in the public distrusting every news source because there's always something that you can pick on.
Right. And I would guess that, working with students at that age, it's hard to recognize bias as
Yeah,
well, too, right? It's like the fish being in the water that they swim in. You don't always see it
yeah,
around you. Yeah. So then you decided that your medium would be visual, that you wanted to record these short videos. Um, What do you think is beneficial about that medium to reach your audience?
Yes, so I think basically the two options that I first thought of were the one I'm using right now, which is videos, and then the other option was doing podcasts or something that's more audio. And so I evaluated the pros and cons of both sides, and I thought with podcasts, one of the first, I guess, cons of doing a podcast that I could think of was with regards to accessibility. So with audio, if it's just pure audio files, of course you can still make, for example, YouTube videos, which is what I'm doing, with just an audio file, and you can have like a blank screen or maybe just your logo. But then that is very hard for people to connect to that particular audio file or that particular video. Um, and which is why I decided to use videos because as people are watching the video, they're not only listening to it, but they can actually see the people talking, and that definitely does help with um, the people relating, the audience being able to relate to what's being said, and to also look at what's going on. And I think another important um, factor that I later realized isn't something that I thought of at the beginning, but as I was doing the video, something that I realized was
Yeah.
there were two interviews that I did that were in Korean. So I was
Yeah.
speaking English, but then the interviewee spoke Korean. And so
Yeah.
obviously, if it was, for example, in a podcast format, it would have been very hard to translate that and show that as subtitles because you can't really do that without visuals. And so as
Sure.
I was making the video, I realized, okay, this is good that I decided to use a video instead because now I can actually show the subtitles and people, the audience can actually understand what's being said.
Do you think you would have made videos if COVID wasn't a barrier, or how does the video? Would you have done it live? Would you have done it in a different way, or what do you think?
Yeah. So I think if it weren't for the pandemic, definitely I would have tried to interview people live. So physically meeting them, meeting together. And then I probably could have tried out a lot of different alternatives.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I know one of the earlier concepts that I was thinking of was hosting an actual event, like an actual discussion, that people could participate in, kind of like a seminar, and where we just talk about these different social issues. But then with the pandemic, obviously, it became very difficult to host an event like that, which is
Right.
why I switched to this different format of having interviews that are separate and then uploading them onto YouTube. Um, yeah,
Yeah. It's funny how sometimes the thing that seems like the challenge actually turns out to be the great idea,
yeah,
right? And in this case, and so like you brought up a moment ago that you used interviewees that were speaking different languages, right? How did that, what was the added benefit of being able to communicate in more than one language for this venture?
yes. I think because we are located in Korea, so obviously the two, and because I'm going to an international school, the two main languages used oftentimes are English and Korean. And I
Right.
think, for example, with some of my subjects or some of the topics that I talked about in my interviews, um, they had a direct connection to Korea. And also other times because I was trying to make the topics as relatable and as relevant to my audience as possible. So sometimes I tried to connect it back to Korea, even if the topic itself wasn't necessarily directly related to Korea.
Sure.
And so as a result, especially in that case of the Korean interviewee, who
Hmm.
was an adult and he was a professional in that field. So that's why he spoke Korean. And so I found that definitely that helped out because if I was limited to, for example, only English, then it would have been very difficult for me to interview that person. Maybe I might have been able to interview him, but later as I was translating, it would have been very difficult for me to find the right words for what he said, and also for
Right.
me to actually understand what he was saying as well. And then
Right.
also, of course, vice versa. If I only spoke Korean, then obviously that would have made it very difficult for me to interview all of the other people that I interview who spoke English.
Yeah. So in that way, you were able to be relevant here in your local area while also connecting to things that are happening sort of in our global world, right? Our
Yes.
interconnected experiences, right? And so many of your topics that you touched on were being experienced here in Korea, but also being experienced in lots of places, right? So,
Yes.
can you take a minute to talk about a particular episode and why that topic was something you wanted to cover?
Yes. So I think on a particular topic that I personally um, enjoyed interviewing was with
Yeah,
regards to the effect that the pandemic had on our economy.
yeah,
And so basically the way that I chose the topics was firstly I had an initial list of different topics that I kind of thought were some of the topics that people might be interested in, and then I sent out a survey and then the audience chose a few of the subjects that they wanted me to interview about, and one of I think it was the second or third topic that people wanted was that topic of the impact that the pandemic had on the economy.
right,
And the reason that I thought it was very interesting was because obviously the pandemic is it's arguably the most relevant topic in today's society.
right,
And I think especially in the case of Korea, a lot of people are interested not only in the pandemic but also in our economy. That's just one of the social issues or topics that I think a lot of Koreans can relate to and know a lot about.
right.
So I think that's why I kind of, as I was interviewing it, I also knew a lot about it. I also had a lot of background information. And
Mm-hmm,
then this was the interview where I was interviewing the professional. So
mm-hmm.
that's why I also got to experience that different perspective, that more professional perspective, and to kind of try and connect it back to um, the audience and how we as students or um, international school students or maybe even teachers, foreigners, can kind of look at this issue from that perspective and try to look at it from multiple different perspectives. And I think that's what made that interview really interesting for me.
Yeah, definitely.